A millionaire offers help to a homeless old woman and her granddaughter. An artistic talent emerges in the garden of his mansion. A painting reveals a family secret buried for decades. An encounter at an auction exposes crimes and changes lives forever. The sun had barely risen when Ryan Matthews opened his eyes, staring at the marble ceiling of his luxurious bedroom. At 30 years old, owner of a fortune many could only dream of, he found himself once again confronted by the emptiness that had consumed him for a decade. He rose from the king-size bed, his feet sinking into the Persian rug that covered the hardwood floor. He walked to the window, pushing aside the silk curtains to contemplate the lush gardens surrounding his mansion. The multicolored flowers, centuries-old trees, and immaculate lawn formed a picture of beauty that contrasted with the melancholy in his heart. Ryan sighed, remembering the fateful day when his life changed forever. 10 years ago, his parents, Charles and Elizabeth Matthews, had departed on a business trip. The young Ryan, then 20 years old, was in college when he received the news that shattered his world. The family's private jet had suffered an accident. There were no survivors. In the blink of an eye, the young student found himself an orphan and heir to a business empire. Since then, Ryan buried himself in work, expanding the family business and multiplying his fortune. But financial success did not fill the void left by his parents' absence. The mansion, once filled with laughter and lively conversations, now echoed only with the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional clink of cutlery when he had his solitary meals. He dressed meticulously, choosing a custom-made Italian suit. His reflection in the mirror showed a successful man, but his brown eyes revealed a deep sadness that all the money in the world could not cure. He descended the marble staircase, his steps echoing through the empty mansion. In the immaculate kitchen, the housekeeper, Mrs. Olivia, had already prepared his breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Ryan," she greeted with a warm smile. Ryan returned the greeting, grateful for the constant presence of the woman who had practically raised him after his parents' passing. "Any commitments today, my boy?" asked Mrs. Olivia, serving him a cup of coffee. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing urgent, Olivia. I think I'll take a walk around the city." "I need to clear my head a bit." The housekeeper nodded, a look of concern in her eyes. She knew well the melancholy that afflicted the young master. "It'll do you good, my boy. Some fresh air will be good for you." After coffee, Ryan took the keys to his sports car, but hesitated. For a moment, he considered calling his driver, but decided he wanted to be alone. He left through the mansion gates, driving aimlessly through the streets of New York City. The city pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the quietude of his mansion. Hurried people rushed to work, street vendors shouted offering their products, and traffic formed its usual symphony of horns and engines. Ryan observed everything with a mixture of fascination and disconnection, as if he were a spectator of a real-life movie. Without realizing it, he ended up parking near a park in the city center. He decided to walk a bit, feeling the fresh breeze on his face. The park was relatively quiet on that Tuesday morning, with only a few morning joggers and people walking their dogs. It was then that his eyes caught a scene that made him stop in his tracks. On a park bench, an elderly lady and a girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, were sitting, trying to protect themselves from a light drizzle that was starting to fall. The scene itself would have been moving, but what really caught Ryan's attention was the worn piece of plastic that the two were using as an improvised umbrella. Something about that image touched Ryan deeply. The vulnerability of the scene, the silent dignity of the elderly woman, the curious and innocent look of the girl, all of this formed a picture that contrasted drastically with his world of luxury and isolation. Without thinking twice, Ryan approached the bench. As he got closer, he could hear the soft voice of the elderly woman talking to the girl. "Grandma, I'm hungry," the girl said, her small voice almost lost in the noise of the city. "I know, my love. Soon we'll get something to eat," replied the elderly woman, her voice laden with worry and love. Ryan stopped in front of them, hesitant. The elderly woman looked up, a mix of distrust and weariness in her gaze. The girl, on the other hand, looked at him with curiosity, her eyes shining with an innocence that touched him deeply. "Excuse me," Ryan began, his voice softer than usual. "I couldn't help but notice. You seem to be going through difficulties. Can I help in any way?" The elderly woman frowned, clearly distrustful of the unexpected offer. "We are grateful for your concern, sir, but we're fine," she replied, her tone firm despite their precarious situation. Ryan felt a pang of frustration, but also admiration for the elderly woman's dignity. He was about to insist when the girl spoke, her voice full of hope. "Grandma, what if he's an angel that heaven sent to help us?" The innocence of the question caught both Ryan and the elderly woman by surprise. For a moment, time seemed to freeze in the park. The light rain continued to fall, but Ryan barely noticed it. He found himself lost in the girl's eyes, seeing in them a purity and hope that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The elderly woman looked at her granddaughter, then at Ryan, and something in her expression changed. It was as if the child's hope had melted away some of her distrust. "Perhaps," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Perhaps we could talk a bit, sir." Ryan nodded, feeling that he was about to embark on a journey that would change his life forever. He didn't know yet, but that fortuitous encounter in the park would be the beginning of a profound transformation, not only in his life but in the life of that improvised little family. As he sat down next to them on the park bench, Ryan felt for the first time in a long time a spark of something he had lost a decade ago: purpose. The rain continued to fall gently, but now, under the worn plastic, 3 lonely souls began to weave the first threads of a connection that promised to be stronger and more valuable than any material fortune. The light rain persisted, creating a silver curtain around the park bench where Ryan, the elderly woman, and the girl were seated. The contrast between Ryan's impeccable Italian suit and the simple, worn clothes of the two was striking, but there was something in the scene that transcended appearances. "My name is Ryan Matthews," he introduced himself, his soft voice breaking the silence. "And you are—" The elderly woman hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm Mrs. Grace, and this is my granddaughter, Sophie." The girl smiled shyly upon hearing her name, her curious eyes fixed on Ryan. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Ryan said, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and expectation. "Mrs. Grace, Sophie, you seem to be going through a difficult time. May I ask what happened?" Mrs. Grace sighed deeply, her tired eyes reflecting years of struggle and pain. "It's a long story, Mr. Matthews. Suffice it to say that life isn't always fair, especially to the old and the young." Ryan nodded, understanding that there was much more behind those words than Mrs. Grace was willing to reveal at that moment. He turned to Sophie, who was playing distractedly with the hem of her faded dress. "And you, Sophie, how old are you?" 8, she answered with a smile, revealing a missing front tooth. "I had my birthday last month." The innocence and joy in the girl's voice, despite her circumstances, touched Ryan deeply. He felt a lump form in his throat, remembering his own privileged and carefree childhood. 8 years old is a very special age," he said, forcing a smile. "You must be in school, right?" Sophie's smile faltered a little. "I was, but we had to leave our home and—" "Sophie," Mrs. Grace gently interrupted, placing a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. She turned to Ryan, her eyes now showing a mixture of pride and desperation. "Mr. Matthews, I appreciate your concern, but we don't want to trouble you with our problems. I'm sure a man like you has more important matters to attend to." Ryan felt a pang of frustration. He wanted to help, but didn't know how to overcome the barrier of pride and distrust that Mrs. Grace had erected. It was then that an idea occurred to him. "Mrs. Grace, Sophie, would you like to have coffee with me? I know a bakery nearby that serves delicious hot chocolate. We could shelter from the rain and talk a bit more." Before Mrs. Grace could refuse, Sophie exclaimed excitedly, "Hot chocolate? Can we, Grandma? Please." Mrs. Grace's expression softened at seeing her granddaughter's enthusiasm. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Matthews. We accept your invitation." The 3 of them stood up from the bench, Ryan instinctively offering his arm to help Mrs. Grace. To his surprise, she accepted, leaning lightly on him as they walked. Sophie skipped ahead of them, her contagious energy contrasting with the seriousness of the adults. In the cozy bakery, the aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee enveloped them. Ryan ordered hot chocolate for Sophie, coffee for Mrs. Grace and himself, as well as a variety of breads and cakes. As they ate, the initial tension began to dissipate. Sophie devoured a piece of chocolate cake, a foam mustache from the hot chocolate adorning her upper lip. Ryan couldn't help but smile, remembering his own childhood. "Mr. Matthews," Mrs. Grace began, her voice softer now, "why are you doing this for us?" Ryan thought for a moment before answering. Honestly, Mrs. Grace, I can't fully explain it. When I saw you two in the park, I felt I needed to help. Maybe—" he hesitated. "Maybe I'm looking for a purpose." Mrs. Grace studied him for a long moment, as if seeing beyond the facade of the rich and successful man. "Sometimes, Mr. Matthews, purpose finds us when we least expect it." Her words resonated deeply with Ryan. He felt an unexpected connection with this elderly woman and her granddaughter, a sense that this fortuitous encounter could be the beginning of something significant. "Mrs. Grace, I know we've just met, but I'd really like to help you, not out of pity or charity, but because I feel it's the right thing to do. Do you have a place to stay?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Mrs. Grace lowered her eyes to her coffee cup, the internal struggle visible on her face. We've been managing, Mr. Matthews." "I don't want you to think we're—" "Grandma," Sophie interrupted, her voice serious despite the chocolate mustache. "The angel gentleman wants to help us. You always say we should be grateful when someone offers help from the heart." The silence that followed was broken by Ryan's soft laughter. "Angel gentleman? I don't think I've ever been called that before." Mrs. Grace couldn't contain a small smile. "My granddaughter has a fertile imagination, Mr. Matthews, but she's not wrong about gratitude." She paused, as if gathering courage. "The truth is that no, we don't have a place to stay. We lost our home a few weeks ago due to circumstances beyond our control." Ryan nodded, feeling the weight of the unspoken words. "I understand. Well, I have a proposal for you. On my property, there's a small guest house in the garden. It's comfortable and fully furnished. I'd like to offer it to you for as long as you need." Sophie's eyes widened with excitement, but Mrs. Grace seemed hesitant. "Mr. Matthews, your offer is very generous, but—" "Please call me Ryan," he gently interrupted. "And it's not generosity, Mrs. Grace, it's an opportunity for you to have a safe place to stay, and for me—" he paused, searching for the right words. "For me, it's a chance to do something meaningful." Mrs. Grace looked at Sophie, who was practically vibrating with enthusiasm, and then back at Ryan. There was a visible struggle in her eyes, pride and need in conflict. "Grandma, please," Sophie pleaded softly. "Can we at least see the place?" Finally, Mrs. Grace nodded. "Very well, Ryan, we accept to see this guest house, but I don't promise anything beyond that." Ryan smiled, feeling a wave of relief and excitement. "Great, we can go right now if you want." As they left the bakery, the rain had stopped, and a shy rainbow was forming in the sky. Ryan couldn't help but think it was a sign of hope, not only for Mrs. Grace and Sophie, but also for himself. As they walked towards his car, Ryan wondered how his life would change from that moment on. He didn't know yet, but that simple act of kindness was about to trigger a series of events that would transform not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Ryan's car glided smoothly through the streets of New York City, leaving behind the bustle of downtown and entering the more affluent neighborhoods. Mrs. Grace looked out the window with a mixture of fascination and apprehension, while Sophie, in the back seat, couldn't contain her excitement. "Wow, look at that house, Grandma, it's huge!" the girl exclaimed at each mansion they passed. Ryan smiled discreetly, observing his guests' reactions in the rearview mirror. "We're almost there," he announced, turning onto a tree-lined street. When the imposing gate of his property opened, Mrs. Grace couldn't suppress a gasp of surprise. Ryan's mansion, with its imposing architecture and meticulously manicured gardens, was a spectacle in itself. "My God, Mrs. Grace murmured. It's a princess castle," Sophie completed, her eyes shining with excitement. Ryan laughed softly. "Well, not exactly a castle, but it is my home." He parked the car and turned to his guests. "Shall we? I want to show you the guest house." They got out of the car and were greeted by Mrs. Olivia, who looked curiously at the newcomers. "Olivia, these are Mrs. Grace and her granddaughter Sophie. They'll be staying with us for a while," Ryan explained. "Please prepare some snacks and bring them to the guest house." "Of course, Mr. Ryan," replied Olivia, casting an intrigued look at her employer before retreating to the kitchen. Ryan guided Mrs. Grace and Sophie through the lush gardens. Sophie ran ahead, enchanted by the colorful flowers and ornamental statues. Mrs. Grace walked more slowly, leaning on the arm that Ryan had gently offered. "It's all so beautiful," the elderly woman commented, her voice laden with emotion. It's been so long since I've seen such beauty. Ryan felt a lump in his throat. Sometimes I fear I don't appreciate all this enough, he confessed. But having you here, it's like I'm seeing everything with new eyes. They arrived at the guest house, a charming and cozy building hidden among leafy trees. It was smaller than the main mansion, but still spacious and elegant. Here we are, Ryan announced, opening the door. Please make yourselves at home. Sophie was the first to enter, letting out exclamations of joy at each new room she discovered. Mrs. Grace entered more hesitantly, her eyes scanning the elegant furniture, silk curtains, and soft carpets. Ryan, it's too much. We can't accept, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ryan placed a gentle hand on the elderly woman's shoulder. Mrs. Grace, please, I know it's a lot to process, but I'd sincerely like you to stay. You wouldn't be doing me a smaller favor than I'm doing for you. Before Mrs. Grace could respond, Sophie came running back from exploring the bedrooms. Grandma, there's a room just for me with a huge bed full of pillows. The girl's enthusiasm was contagious, and Mrs. Grace couldn't help but smile. Well, it seems we've been outnumbered, haven't we? She said, looking at Ryan with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. At that moment, Olivia arrived with a tray of snacks. As everyone settled in the living room to eat, Ryan noticed Sophie looking curiously at an empty easel in the corner of the room. Do you like art, Sophie? He asked. The girl's eyes lit up. I love drawing. At school, the teacher always said I had talent. It's true, Mrs. Grace confirmed, a touch of pride in her voice. Sophie has always had a gift for the arts. Ryan smiled, an idea forming in his mind. How about if tomorrow I bring some painting materials for you, Sophie? We could set up a small studio right here. The proposal was met with a cry of joy from Sophie and a look of surprise from Mrs. Grace. Ryan, you're already doing so much for us. It's a pleasure. Believe me, Ryan insisted. He was surprised to realize that he really felt this way. For the first time in years, he felt truly excited about something. As the afternoon progressed, Ryan helped Mrs. Grace and Sophie get settled. He promised to bring new clothes the next day and ensured they had everything they needed to spend the night comfortably. When he finally said goodbye, it was already night. Walking back to the main mansion, Ryan felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, but also a restlessness, as if something important was about to happen. Entering his room, his eyes fell on a framed photograph of his parents. What would you think of all this? He murmured to the silent image. Lying on his king-size bed, Ryan reflected on the events of the day. It had started like any other, grey and purposeless. Now suddenly his life seemed full of colours and possibilities. As sleep enveloped him, Ryan couldn't imagine how this simple act of kindness would trigger a series of events that would change his life forever. Nor could he predict the secrets and challenges that awaited him, hidden in the shadows of Mrs. Grace's past and Sophie's uncertain future. In the guest house, Mrs. Grace sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, gently stroking her sleeping granddaughter's hair. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of gratitude and concern. God protect us, she whispered, and may I have the strength to face what's to come. With these words, she got up silently and went to her own room, carrying with her the weight of long-held secrets and the fear of what the future might bring. Night fell over the Matthews property, enveloping the mansion and the guest house in a cloak of quietude. But beneath this apparent tranquility, new connections were forming, destined to intertwine the lives of Ryan, Mrs. Grace, and Sophie in ways none of them could predict. The dawn brought with it a new energy to the Matthews mansion. Ryan woke up earlier than usual, a sense of purpose driving him. After a quick breakfast, he headed to the city centre, determined to fulfill his promise to Sophie. Meanwhile, in the guest house, Mrs. Grace woke up slowly, still getting used to the comfort of the soft mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets. For a moment she feared it was all just a dream, but the sound of Sophie's animated voice coming from the room next door brought her back to reality. "Grandma, Grandma, wake up! Look how beautiful the day is!" Sophie came running into the room, her eyes shining with excitement. Mrs. Grace smiled, sitting up in bed. "Good morning, my love. Did you sleep well?" "Yes. The bed is so soft it feels like a cloud." Sophie jumped on the bed, hugging her grandmother. "Do you think Uncle Ryan will bring the paints today?" "Uncle Ryan?" Mrs. Grace raised an eyebrow, surprised by the quick familiarity her granddaughter showed. "He's so nice, Grandma. He seems like an uncle." Sophie shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Grace sighed, a mixture of gratitude and concern in her heart. "Sophie, darling, remember that we're here as guests. We can't get too attached." Before Sophie could respond, they heard a soft knock at the door. It was Olivia, bringing a tray with a hearty breakfast. "Good morning, ladies," the housekeeper greeted with a warm smile. "Mr. Ryan asked me to bring breakfast and inform you that he'll be back soon with some surprises." As they enjoyed the meal, Mrs. Grace couldn't help but reflect on the sudden change in their lives. Ryan's generosity was surprising and, at the same time, disconcerting. She knew they needed this help, but feared the complications that might arise. A few hours later, the sound of a car arriving announced Ryan's return. Sophie ran to the window, her anticipation palpable. "He's here, Grandma, and he's carrying a lot of things." Ryan entered the guest house, his arms full of bags and packages. His face lit up upon seeing Sophie's excitement. "Good morning, I hope I didn't take too long," he said, placing the packages on the table. "I brought some things I thought you might need." As he unpacked, Ryan revealed new clothes for Mrs. Grace and Sophie, personal hygiene products, and, to the girls' delight, a complete set of painting materials. "Oh, Ryan," Mrs. Grace murmured, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. I don't know how to thank you." "No need to thank me," Ryan replied with a sincere smile. "It's a pleasure to be able to help." Sophie could barely contain her excitement at the sight of the brushes, paints, and canvases. "Can I start painting now, Grandma? Please." Mrs. Grace nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Of course, my love. But first, how about we try on the new clothes and freshen up a bit?" As Sophie ran off to explore her new clothes, Mrs. Grace turned to Ryan. "Ryan, your generosity is immense, but we need to talk about our situation. I can't accept all this without at least explaining how we got to this point." Ryan noticed the seriousness in Mrs. Grace's tone. "Of course, Mrs. Grace. How about we take a walk through the gardens while Sophie gets ready? We can talk in private." Minutes later, the two were walking side by side along the winding paths of the garden. The scent of flowers and the soft murmur of a nearby fountain created a serene atmosphere. "Ryan," Mrs. Grace began, her voice laden with emotion, "I need you to understand that our situation is complicated. There are things in my past, secrets I've carried for years." Ryan listened attentively, feeling the weight of the unspoken words. "Mrs. Grace, we all have secrets and regrets. I'm not here to judge, only to help." The elderly woman stopped, turning to face Ryan. Her eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, seemed to contain decades of pain and experience. "My life wasn't always like this, you know. There was a time when I was someone with talent, with promises of a bright future." Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine, as if he were about to hear something that would change everything. "What kind of talent, Mrs. Grace?" "I was a painter," she revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. "A promising artist, but then something happened. Something that destroyed my career and forced me to disappear." The words hung in the air, laden with implications. Ryan felt an unexpected connection with this woman, as if their destinies were somehow intertwined. "What happened?" he asked softly. Mrs. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Sophie's excited shout, who came running towards them, dressed in her new clothes. "Grandma, Uncle Ryan, come see, I started my first painting." The moment of revelation was broken, but Ryan could feel that he was on the verge of discovering something crucial. As they followed Sophie back to the guest house, he couldn't help but notice the look of relief mixed with apprehension on Mrs. Grace's face. In the room improvised as a studio, Sophie proudly showed her work in progress. A colorful and abstract portrait that somehow captured the essence of the mansion and its gardens. "It's beautiful, Sophie," Ryan praised, genuinely impressed by the girl's talent. Mrs. Grace observed the scene with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "She has the gift," she murmured, almost to herself. "Just as I had—" Ryan looked from Mrs. Grace to Sophie, feeling that he was facing a puzzle whose pieces he still couldn't fully fit together. Something in Sophie's talent, in Mrs. Grace's untold story, and in his own past, seemed to be connected in a way he didn't yet understand. As he watched Sophie paint, her small fingers handling the brushes with surprising skill for her age, Ryan felt a certainty grow within him. The decision to help Mrs. Grace and Sophie wasn't just an act of charity, but the beginning of a journey that would lead him to discoveries about his own past and perhaps about the true meaning of family. The day progressed, and with it the feeling that great revelations were to come. Ryan knew that behind Mrs. Grace's gentle smile and Sophie's innocence, there were untold stories and secrets that, once revealed, would change the course of their lives forever. The days that followed brought a new routine to the Matthews mansion. Ryan, who previously lived immersed in his solitude and business, now found himself eager to return home and spend time with Mrs. Grace and Sophie. The presence of the two had brought life and color to his once monochromatic world. On a sunny afternoon, while Sophie was animatedly painting in the garden, Ryan found Mrs. Grace sitting on a bench, observing her granddaughter with a distant look. He approached, feeling that perhaps it was time to resume the conversation interrupted days ago. "Mrs. Grace," he began softly, sitting next to her, "that day in the garden, you were about to tell me something about your past." The elderly woman sighed deeply, her eyes never leaving Sophie's figure. "Ah, Ryan, there are so many things I'd like to leave buried. But I see Sophie. I see her talent blossoming, and I fear that my past might one day catch up with her." Ryan gently placed his hand over Mrs. Grace's. "Sometimes sharing our burdens can make them lighter. I'm here to listen, without judgments." Mrs. Grace finally turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Very well. You deserve to know, especially considering everything you've done for us." She paused as if gathering courage, and then began her story. "Many years ago, I was a promising young artist. My paintings were starting to gain recognition, and I had dreams of becoming a great painter. It was during this time that I met two men who would change my life forever." Ryan listened attentively, feeling that he was about to hear something crucial. The first was an influential gallery owner, Charles Matthews. He saw potential in my work and promised to launch me in the art world. He was charming, sophisticated, and married. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Charles Matthews was his father's name. Mrs. Grace continued, not noticing Ryan's reaction. The second man was Anthony Ferreira, an already established artist and Charles's rival. Anthony became obsessed with my work and with me. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "Charles and we got involved. It was brief but intense. When I discovered I was pregnant, he had already ended our affair and returned to his family." Ryan felt as if the world was spinning. His father, the man he had always seen as an example of integrity, had had an extramarital affair. "What happened next?" he asked, his voice barely disguising his agitation. "Anthony discovered about the pregnancy. He became furious. He started spreading rumors about me, saying that I was forging works by other artists. My reputation was destroyed overnight." Tears now flowed freely down Mrs. Grace's face. "I ran away. I left everything behind. My daughter was born far from all this, and I swore that I would protect her from this world that had betrayed me." Ryan was stunned. Mrs. Grace's story not only revealed an unknown side of his father, but also raised disturbing questions. "Mrs. Grace," he began hesitantly, "this daughter, is she Sophie's mother?" The elderly woman nodded slowly. "Yes. My Isabella. She grew up knowing nothing about her father or my past. She got married, had Sophie, and—" Her voice faltered. "And what happened to her?" Ryan asked softly. "A car accident 2 years ago. She and her husband, Sophie, was left with just me." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions and shocking revelations. Ryan struggled to process everything he had heard. If Mrs. Grace's story was true, and something inside him said it was, did this mean that Sophie was his half-sister? Before he could express his thoughts, they were interrupted by Sophie, who came running towards them, a paper in her hand. "Grandma! Uncle Ryan! Look what I drew!" Both tried to smile, attempting to mask the tension of the moment. Sophie proudly showed her drawing, a portrait of a man with a serious expression, with features that Ryan immediately recognized. "Who is that, darling?" Mrs. Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," Sophie replied innocently. "It's a man who appeared in my dream. He seemed important." Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. The man in the drawing was, without a doubt, his father, Charles Matthews. At that moment, the sound of a car arriving broke the tension. Olivia appeared, looking agitated. "Mr. Ryan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a man at the entrance. He says he needs to speak with you urgently." He introduced himself as Anthony Ferreira. The name fell like a bomb between them. Mrs. Grace visibly paled, clutching Sophie's hand. Ryan stood up, his mind in turmoil. The past that Mrs. Grace so feared seemed to be finally catching up with them. He looked at the elderly woman and Sophie, feeling a protective instinct he had never experienced before. "Stay here with Sophie," he said to Mrs. Grace. "I'll see what this man wants." As he walked towards the main house, Ryan knew he was about to face not only Anthony Ferreira, but also the shadows of his father's past and the secrets that had remained buried for so long. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the mansion's gardens. Ryan felt as if these shadows were a perfect metaphor for the secrets and lies that were about to come to light, threatening to forever change the course of their lives. Ryan walked with firm steps towards the mansion's entrance, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. Mrs. Grace's revelations still echoed in his head, mixing with the apprehension of the imminent confrontation with Anthony Ferreira. Upon reaching the main gate, Ryan saw a middle-aged man with graying hair and penetrating eyes. There was something in his posture that exuded a mixture of arrogance and anxiety. "Mr. Ferreira, I presume," said Ryan, keeping his voice steady. "What brings you to my house?" Anthony Ferreira studied Ryan for a moment before responding. "You must be Charles Matthews' son. The resemblance is remarkable." Ryan felt a tightness in his chest at hearing his father's name. "Yes, I'm Ryan Matthews. Now please tell me what you want." Ferreira took a step forward, his voice low and intense. "I'm looking for Grace Parker. I have reasons to believe she's here." Ryan kept his expression neutral, though his heart raced. "And why do you think that?" "Let's stop playing games, Mr. Matthews," Ferreira said, impatient. "I know she's here, and I also know she has something that belongs to me." "And what would that be?" Ryan asked, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his caution. Ferreira hesitated for a moment, as if pondering how much he should reveal. "A painting, a work of art of inestimable value, both financial and personal." At that moment, Ryan heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Mrs. Grace approaching, her face a mask of determination and fear. "Anthony," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "after so many years, you still haven't given up." Ferreira's eyes narrowed upon seeing Mrs. Grace. "Grace, we finally meet again. You know why I'm here." Ryan looked from one to the other, feeling the palpable tension in the air. "Can someone explain to me what's going on?" Mrs. Grace sighed deeply. "Ryan, a long time ago, before you were born, I painted a picture. It was the best work I had ever created, capturing something special." Ferreira interrupted, his voice laden with bitterness. "She painted a portrait of your father, Mr. Matthews, a portrait that revealed more than it should have." Ryan felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. "A portrait of my father? But why?" "Because she loved him," Ferreira spat out the words. "And because I loved her. It was a perfect triangle of betrayal and lies." Mrs. Grace closed her eyes as if the words had physically wounded her. "Anthony, please. That was so long ago." "Where's the painting, Grace?" Ferreira demanded, taking a threatening step in her direction. Ryan placed himself between them, protecting Mrs. Grace. "Mr. Ferreira, I think it's time for you to leave." But Ferreira didn't back down. "You don't understand, boy. That painting, it contains secrets. Secrets that could destroy reputations, shake fortunes." "What kind of secrets?" Ryan asked, his curiosity overcoming his prudence. Mrs. Grace intervened, her voice laden with emotion. "Ryan, the painting, it shows your father in a moment of vulnerability, a moment that reveals truths about business, about choices he made." "Illegal choices," Ferreira added with a cruel smile. "Your father wasn't the saint everyone thought, Mr. Matthews." Ryan felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Everything he believed about his father, about his family, was crumbling before his eyes. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air. "Grandma!" Everyone turned to see Sophie running towards them, a paper in her hand. She stopped abruptly upon seeing the stranger, her eyes widening with fear. "Sophie, go back inside," Mrs. Grace said urgently. But Ferreira had already seen the drawing in the girl's hand. His face paled. That's impossible, he murmured. Ryan, sensing the change in the atmosphere, took the drawing from Sophie's hands. It was another portrait, this time showing a younger man, but unmistakably Anthony Ferreira. How? Ferreira stammered, looking from Sophie to the drawing. Mrs. Grace hugged Sophie protectively. She has the gift, Anthony, just like I had. She sees things from the past sometimes. Ryan looked at Sophie, then at Mrs. Grace, and finally at Ferreira. The tension in the air was palpable, laden with unrevealed secrets and painful truths. I think we all need to talk, Ryan finally said, his voice firm despite the turmoil of emotions inside him. But not here, not like this, Mr. Ferreira. If you want answers, you'll have to play by my rules. Ferreira seemed to be waging an internal battle, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. Finally, he nodded slowly. Very well, Mr. Matthews. But know that I won't leave without that painting. As Ryan led everyone into the mansion, he couldn't help but feel that he was on the verge of discoveries that would change his life forever. His father's past, Mrs. Grace's secrets, Sophie's mysterious gift, everything seemed to be converging to a crucial point. The sun had completely set, plunging the mansion's gardens into twilight. The shadows seemed to dance around them, as if they were the ghosts of the past finally taking shape. Ryan knew that, after this night, nothing would be the same. The tension was palpable in the living room of the Matthews mansion. Ryan, Mrs. Grace, Sophie, and Anthony Ferreira sat in a charged silence, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock in the corner. The soft light from the lamps cast dramatic shadows on the faces of those present, as if highlighting the secrets each one carried. Ryan was the first to break the silence. Well, we're all here. I think it's time we put all the cards on the table. Anthony Ferreira leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. Before anything else, I want to know more about this girl. How could she draw me without ever having seen me? Mrs. Grace hugged Sophie protectively. I've already told you, Anthony. She has a gift. What kind of gift exactly? Ryan asked, his curiosity momentarily overcoming the other concerns. Mrs. Grace sighed deeply. It's something that runs in the family, in our artistic lineage. Sometimes we are able to see beyond the veil of time, capture images from the past or even the future in our works. Ferreira let out a bitter laugh. That's why your work was so extraordinary, isn't it, Grace? You weren't just painting, you were prophesying. Ryan tried to process this new information. And the painting you did of my father. It was more than a simple portrait, Mrs. Grace admitted, her voice almost a whisper. It showed your father at a crucial moment, making a choice that would change many lives. What choice? Ryan asked, dreading the answer. Ferreira intervened, his voice laden with bitterness. The choice to betray his business partners, to make shady deals that would enrich him at the expense of others. Ryan felt as if the floor was disappearing beneath his feet. No, my father wouldn't do that. Oh, but he did, Ferreira continued mercilessly, and Grace captured it all on her canvas. Charles' expression, the documents in his hands, even the reflection in the mirror showing who he was making the deal with. Mrs. Grace closed her eyes as if the memory was too painful. I didn't know what I was painting at the time. Only later, after Charles saw the painting, did I understand what I had captured. And what happened then? Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Your father panicked, Ferreira answered. He knew that painting could destroy him if it fell into the wrong hands. So, he did what any desperate man would do. He tried to get rid of it. And Grace. Ryan looked at Mrs. Grace, seeking a denial, but found only sadness in her eyes. Is it true? Mrs. Grace nodded slowly. Charles, your father. He offered me a significant amount to disappear, taking the painting with me. He said it was for my own protection, but I knew it was to protect himself. And you accepted? Ryan asked, incredulous. At first, no, Mrs. Grace answered. I loved him, Ryan. I believed we could overcome this together, but then she discovered she was pregnant, Ferreira completed, his tone now softer, and everything changed. The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan looked at Sophie, who had fallen asleep in Mrs. Grace's lap, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Suddenly, the resemblance between the girl and his own features became painfully obvious. Sophie, she's my sister, Ryan murmured, the reality finally sinking in. Mrs. Grace nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. Half-sister, actually. Daughter of my daughter Isabella, and granddaughter of Charles. Ryan abruptly stood up, walking to the window. The night outside seemed to reflect the darkness he felt in his heart. Everything he believed about his family, about his father, was crumbling. "Where is the painting now?" he finally asked without turning around. "Hidden," Mrs. Grace answered, "in a safe place where no one can use it to do harm." Ferreira stood up, his posture less aggressive now. "Grace, you need to understand. That painting, it's not just about Charles. It reveals things about many powerful people, people who would do anything to keep it hidden." "Is that why you want it?" Ryan asked, turning to face Ferreira. "To blackmail these people?" Ferreira hesitated, as if weighing his words. "To do justice," he finally said. "To expose the truth that has been buried for so long." Mrs. Grace shook her head. "At what cost, Anthony? More lives destroyed? More families torn apart?" Silence fell over the room again, heavy with the implications of what had been revealed. Ryan looked at each of those present, feeling the weight of the decision he needed to make. "The painting stays where it is," he finally declared. "At least for now, we need time. Time to process all of this, to decide the best course of action." Ferreira seemed about to protest, but something in Ryan's look made him back down. "Very well, Mr. Matthews, but know that this isn't over. There's much more at stake than you can imagine." As Ferreira prepared to leave, Sophie stirred in her sleep, mumbling something unintelligible. All the adults in the room froze, as if fearing that the slightest sound might awaken not only the girl, but also the ghosts of the past that had been disturbed that night. Ryan watched Ferreira depart, feeling that this wouldn't be the last time the man would cross his path. Turning to Mrs. Grace and Sophie, he felt a mixture of emotions: anger at his father's betrayal, compassion for Mrs. Grace's difficult journey, and a newly discovered love for his sleeping half-sister. "What do we do now?" he asked softly. Mrs. Grace looked at him with tired but determined eyes. "Now, my dear, we begin to rebuild. The truth has come to light, and with it, the chance to heal old wounds and create new bonds." As the night progressed, the Matthews mansion seemed to breathe new air. The revealed secrets, though painful, had paved the way for a new journey. A journey of redemption, forgiveness, and perhaps a family reunited against all odds. The days that followed the night of revelations were a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. Ryan oscillated between moments of deep reflection and periods of intense activity, as if trying to balance his newly shaken world through action. One morning, about a week after the confrontation with Anthony Ferreira, Ryan found Mrs. Grace in the garden, watching Sophie, who was absorbed in painting under the shade of a large tree. "How is she handling all of this?" Ryan asked, sitting down next to the elderly woman. Mrs. Grace sighed, a tired smile on her lips. "Sophie is resilient. She senses that something has changed, but her innocence protects her from the darker details." Ryan nodded, his eyes fixed on the girl he now knew to be his half-sister. "And you, Mrs. Grace, how are you feeling?" The elderly woman was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. Relieved in part. "Carrying secrets for so long. It's a heavy burden, Ryan, but I'm also apprehensive. Anthony won't give up easily." "About that," Ryan began, hesitant, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we face this head-on. The painting, I think we need to see it." "Mrs." Grace turned to face him, surprise evident on her face. "Are you sure? What's painted there? It could change everything you think about your father." "It already has," Ryan replied, his voice firm. "Now I need to know the whole truth, no matter how painful it may be." At that moment, they were interrupted by Sophie, who was running towards them, a drawing in her hands. "Uncle Ryan, Grandma, look what I painted!" Both leaned in to see the drawing, and their expressions transformed into shock. On the canvas, Sophie had portrayed a scene that neither of them recognized. A man, clearly Charles Matthews, was standing in an elegant office, shaking hands with another man whose face was hidden in shadows. In the background, partially visible, was what appeared to be the edge of a painting. "Sophie, darling," Mrs. Grace asked, her voice trembling, "where did this image come from?" The girl shrugged, innocent. "I just saw it in my head. It's the man from the other drawings, isn't it? He seemed important." Ryan and Mrs. Grace exchanged worried looks. Sophie's gift seemed to be manifesting with more force, revealing fragments of a past they barely understood. "Ryan, Mrs. Grace said softly, "I think you're right. We need to see the painting. And maybe it's time for Sophie to understand a bit more about her gift and our history." Ryan nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. "Where is the painting?" Mrs. Grace hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's kept in a safe in an art gallery downtown. An old friend has been taking care of it all these years." "Then that's where we'll go," Ryan decided. "Tomorrow itself." As they made plans for the visit to the gallery, none of them noticed a figure watching from a distance, partially hidden by bushes. Anthony Ferreira smiled to himself, satisfied that his plan was unfolding exactly as he had foreseen. The next morning, Ryan, Mrs. Grace and Sophie were preparing to leave when the mansion's doorbell rang. Olivia answered and returned with a concerned expression. "Mr. Ryan, there's a lady here. She says she's a lawyer and needs to speak urgently with you." Ryan frowned, intrigued. "Who is she?" "She introduced herself as Ms. Helena Vance," Olivia replied. The name meant nothing to Ryan, but something in Mrs. Grace's expression caught his attention. The elderly woman had visibly paled. "Grace, do you know her?" Mrs. Grace nodded slowly, her voice almost a whisper. "Helena, she was your father's lawyer, Ryan, and also the woman Charles was with when—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Ryan understood. The tension in the air was palpable. Helena Vance's unexpected arrival threatened to destabilize the fragile balance they had achieved. "Should I send her away, sir?" Olivia asked, sensing the discomfort. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "No, let's receive her. Maybe it's time to hear another side of this story." As they waited for Helena to enter, Ryan couldn't help but notice the drawing that Sophie was holding firmly against her chest, the same one she had made the day before. Somehow, he felt that image, like the painting they were about to see, would be the key to unraveling the mysteries surrounding his family. Helena Vance's arrival promised to bring even more secrets to light, threatening to shake the new connections Ryan had formed with Mrs. Grace and Sophie. As he prepared to face another piece of the complicated puzzle of his past, Ryan wondered how many more revelations his heart could endure. The morning sun bathed the living room, creating a dramatic contrast with the shadows that seemed to accumulate in the corners, as if they were the secrets of the past, refusing to remain hidden. The tension was palpable, as everyone awaited Helena's entrance, each aware that the next moments could change the course of their lives forever. The sound of high heels echoed through the hallway of the Matthews mansion, announcing Helena Vance's arrival. When she entered the living room, time seemed to freeze for an instant. Helena was an elegant woman in her 50s, with impeccably arranged grey hair and astute eyes that seemed to assess everything around her. Ryan stood up to greet her, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and curiosity. "Miss Vance, welcome. I'm Ryan Matthews." Helena studied him for a moment, a flash of recognition in her eyes. "The resemblance to your father is remarkable, Mr. Matthews." Her gaze then turned to Mrs. Grace, who remained seated, rigid as a statue. "Grace," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and something else. "Guilt, perhaps?" "After so many years," Mrs. Grace nodded stiffly. "Helena, I didn't expect to see you again." The tension in the air was palpable. Sophie, sensing the heavy atmosphere, approached Mrs. Grace, holding her hand. Helena noticed the movement, and her eyes widened slightly upon seeing the girl. "And who is this charming young lady?" Before anyone could answer, Sophie spoke, her voice clear and innocent. "I'm Sophie. You're the lady from the painting." A stunned silence fell over the room. Helena visibly paled, while Mrs. Grace and Ryan exchanged alarmed looks. "Painting?" Helena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What painting, dear?" Ryan quickly intervened. "Why don't we sit down? It seems we have a lot to discuss." As everyone settled in, Ryan couldn't help but notice how Helena seemed unable to take her eyes off Sophie. There was something in her look, a mixture of fascination and fear. "Ms. Vance," Ryan began, deciding to get straight to the point. "What brings you here today?" Helena seemed to compose herself, reassuming her professional posture. "Mr. Matthews, I came because I received concerning information. Information about a certain item that may compromise your late father's reputation, and by extension, the interests of the Matthews family." "The painting," Mrs. Grace said softly. Helena nodded slowly. Yes, Grace. The painting you made so many years ago. Ryan leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Ms. Vance, what exactly does this painting show and why is it so dangerous? Helena hesitated, looking from Ryan to Mrs. Grace and back to Sophie. Finally, she sighed deeply. The painting, it captures a crucial moment. A moment when your father, Mr. Matthews, was about to make a deal that would change the course of many lives. An illegal deal? Ryan pressed. Not exactly illegal, Helena replied carefully, but certainly ethically questionable. It involved the acquisition of lands that belonged to indigenous communities, lands rich in natural resources. Mrs. Grace closed her eyes, as if the memory was too painful. I didn't know what I was painting at the time. I only realized later, when I saw Charles's reaction. Helena turned to Grace, her voice softer now. Grace, you need to understand, Charles wasn't a bad man. He believed he was doing what was best for the company, for progress. At the expense of innocent lives? Ryan asked, his voice laden with disappointment. Helena shook her head. It wasn't that simple. There were plans to relocate the communities, to create jobs. But the painting, it showed only the moment of decision without context. And why are you here now? Mrs. Grace asked, her voice firm. After so many years? Helena hesitated again before answering. Because the past is threatening to come to light. There are people, powerful people, who believe the painting still exists. And they will do anything to find it and destroy it. At that moment, Sophie, who had been quiet until then, spoke again. The Shadow Man. He wants the painting. All the adults turned to look at the girl, shocked. Helena, in particular, seemed stunned. Sophie, Ryan asked gently, what Shadow Man? The girl picked up her drawing, the same one she had made days before, and showed it to everyone. This man here in the corner. He's hidden, but he wants what's on the table. Helena leaned in to see the drawing, and her face lost all color. My God, she whispered. How could she know? Ryan and Mrs. Grace exchanged significant looks. It was time to reveal another part of the truth. Ms. Vance, Ryan began carefully, there's more to this story than you know. Sophie has a gift that seems to be linked to the past somehow. Helena looked from Sophie to Mrs. Grace, understanding dawning in her eyes. The same gift you had, Grace. The ability to see beyond. Mrs. Grace nodded slowly. Yes, and it seems that in Sophie, this gift is even stronger. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone absorbed the implications of this revelation. Helena was the first to break it. This changes everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If what Sophie sees is true, then the danger is even greater than we imagined. Ryan stood up, a renewed determination in his eyes. Then it's decided. We need to see this painting. Now, as everyone prepared to leave, Ryan couldn't help but notice Helena's look at Sophie, a mixture of fear and fascination. He wondered how much more there was to discover about his family's past and what role Sophie would play in this revelation. The group left the mansion, each carrying the weight of secrets and revelations. The sky, once clear, now showed dark clouds on the horizon, as if nature itself was foreshadowing the emotional storms that were to come. As Ryan's car left the property, no one noticed the solitary figure watching from afar. Anthony Ferreira smiled to himself, knowing that his plan was unfolding exactly as planned. Soon all the secrets would come to light, and he would finally have his revenge. Ryan's car weaved through the busy streets of New York City, carrying a tense and silent group. Ryan was at the wheel with Helena beside him, while Mrs. Grace and Sophie occupied the back seat. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was dense, loaded with expectations and apprehensions. Turn left here, Mrs. Grace instructed softly, breaking the silence. The gallery is at the end of this street. Ryan nodded, maneuvering the car as indicated. His thoughts were in turmoil, divided between the anxiety of seeing the painting and the concern about what this revelation could mean for all of them. Finally, they arrived at an old building, its Art Deco facade contrasting with the modern skyscrapers around it. Velasco Gallery, read elegant letters above the entrance. Miguel Velasco, Mrs. Grace explained as they got out of the car, is an old friend. He's been keeping the painting all these years without asking questions. As they entered the gallery, they were greeted by an elderly man with white hair and gentle eyes. Grace, my dear, he exclaimed, embracing her warmly. His eyes then fell on the rest of the group, lingering on Sophie. And who are your companions? After the introductions, Miguel led them to the back of the gallery, through a maze of corridors filled with artwork. Finally, they stopped in front of a heavy steel door. "The safe," Miguel announced, typing a complex sequence on an electronic panel. The door opened with a hiss, revealing a small climate-controlled room. Mrs. Grace entered first, her body tense with anticipation. The others followed, watching as she approached a large canvas covered by a cloth. "It's time," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. With a fluid motion, she removed the cloth, revealing the painting that had remained hidden for so long. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The painting was breathtaking, not only for its impeccable technique, but for the power of the scene it portrayed. In the center of the painting was Charles Matthews, younger but unmistakable. His face was a mask of determination mixed with a touch of doubt. He was standing in a luxurious office, shaking hands with a man whose face was partially in shadows. On the table between them, documents were scattered, some clearly showing land maps. But what really caught the eye was the mirror on the wall behind them. In it, reflected with frightening clarity, was the image of an indigenous community, their simple houses in stark contrast to the opulence of the office. Ryan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the figure of his father. "It's true then," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "He really did this." Helena placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft. "Ryan, you need to understand the context." But Ryan interrupted her, his voice now firm. "No, Helena, there's no context that justifies this. My father, he was willing to destroy lives for profit." Mrs. Grace approached, her eyes never leaving the painting. "I didn't understand at the time. I painted what I saw, what I felt. Only later did I realize the weight of what I had captured." Sophie, who had remained quiet until then, suddenly let out a small cry. Everyone turned to her, alarmed. "Sophie, what is it?" Mrs. Grace asked, concerned. The girl pointed to a corner of the painting, an area that initially seemed to be in shadows. "The man, the shadow man, he's there." Ryan leaned in, straining his eyes. Slowly, a figure began to materialize in the penumbra of the painting, a man observing the main scene, his face partially hidden, but with a cruel smile clearly visible. Helena gasped. "My God, it's him. How did we not see this before?" "Who is he?" Ryan demanded, turning to Helena. The lawyer hesitated for a moment before answering. "His name is Edward Morgan. He is one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the country. It was he who orchestrated the entire land deal." Mrs. Grace staggered slightly, leaning against the wall. "Edward, he sought me out after the painting was done. He offered a fortune to buy it. When I refused, the threats began." Ryan felt a wave of anger grow inside him. "Is that why you ran? Is that why you hid everything from me, from Sophie?" Mrs. Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. "I had to protect my daughter, and then Sophie. Edward isn't someone who gives up easily." At that moment, Helena's cell phone rang, making everyone jump. She answered, her face paling as she listened to the person on the other end of the line. "I understand," she finally said, hanging up. Her look was one of pure panic when she turned to the group. "It was my contact in the police, Edward Morgan. He's on his way. Someone must have followed us." Panic spread through the room. Miguel quickly locked the safe door, but everyone knew that wouldn't protect them for long. Ryan looked at the painting, at Sophie, at Mrs. Grace. In a matter of seconds, he made a decision. "We need to get the painting out of here, now." As everyone moved frantically, trying to find a way to remove and hide the large canvas, Sophie remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the painting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadows in the painting seemed to move, as if they were coming to life. The veil between past and present was breaking, and secrets long buried were about to come to light in a way no one could predict. Panic was palpable in the small safe of the Velasco gallery. Ryan, with Miguel's help, was desperately trying to remove the painting from its frame, while Helena and Mrs. Grace searched for a way to hide or transport it. "Hurry!" Helena urged, her voice trembling. "Edward can't find this here." While the adults moved frantically, Sophie remained still, her eyes fixed on the painting. Suddenly she gasped, drawing everyone's attention. "The shadows! They're moving!" exclaimed the girl, pointing to the canvas. Initially, everyone thought it was just Sophie's imagination, but looking closer, they saw with astonishment that she was right. The shadows in the painting seemed to ripple, as if they were coming to life. "My God," whispered Mrs. Grace, recognizing the phenomenon. "It's the gift. It's manifesting through the painting." Before anyone could react, they heard raised voices coming from the gallery corridor. Edward Morgan had arrived. "We need to get out of here." "Now!" Ryan said, his voice firm despite the evident fear in his eyes. Miguel pointed to an almost invisible door at the back of the safe. "This way. It leads to a service corridor. You can escape through the back." Quickly, Ryan wrapped the painting in a protective cloth, carrying it carefully. The group hurried through the secret passage, with Miguel staying behind to delay Edward. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of paints and solvents. They could hear raised voices and the sound of things being knocked over in the gallery. "Edward is furious," Helena whispered, her face pale with fear. "He won't give up easily." Finally, they reached a door that led to an alley behind the gallery. Ryan peeked cautiously before signaling for the others to follow him. "My car is just 2 blocks from here," he said. "If we can get there." But his plan was interrupted by a cry from Sophie. "Look!" Everyone turned to see what had frightened the girl. The painting, still wrapped in the cloth, was glowing. A soft light emanated from within the fabric, pulsing like a heart. "What's happening?" Ryan asked, looking to Mrs. Grace for answers. The elderly woman shook her head, her eyes wide with awe. "It's the gift. It's reacting to the danger. The painting is trying to protect us." At that moment, they heard voices approaching the alley. Edward and his men were getting closer. "We have no choice," Helena said, her voice firm despite the fear. "We need to run." The group launched themselves onto the streets of New York, Ryan carrying the glowing painting, Mrs. Grace firmly holding Sophie's hand, and Helena leading the way. The streets were full of pedestrians and cars, providing temporary cover. As they ran, Ryan couldn't help but notice how people looked curiously at the painting in his arms. The glow was getting more intense, almost as if it were responding to the urgency of the situation. They turned a corner and saw Ryan's car parked a few meters away. But their relief was short-lived. A group of men in suits, clearly associated with Edward, was approaching from the other side of the street. "We're surrounded," Helena whispered, panic evident in her voice. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The glow from the painting suddenly intensified, engulfing the entire group in a blinding light. For a moment, Ryan felt as if he were floating, disconnected from reality. When the light dimmed, they found themselves elsewhere. They were in a wooded park with no sign of the pursuers or the chaos of the New York streets. What happened?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling with amazement. Mrs. Grace looked around, recognition dawning in her eyes. "This park, it's where I used to paint when I was young. The painting brought us to the past." Sophie, who seemed less frightened and more fascinated, pointed to a young woman sitting on a nearby bench, sketching in a notebook. "Grandma, it's you." With astonishment, the group realized that the girl was right. The young woman on the bench was, without a doubt, a younger version of Mrs. Grace. "Impossible," Helena murmured, her rational mind struggling to accept what her eyes were seeing. Ryan, still holding the now silent painting, looked at Mrs. Grace. "What do we do now?" The elderly woman took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving her younger version. "Now, my dear, we discover the truth. All of it." As the group gathered, trying to understand what had happened and what to do next, none of them noticed the solitary figure watching from afar. Anthony Ferreira, somehow transported along with them, smiled to himself. The game had changed, but his objectives remained the same. The journey to the past had begun, and with it, the promise of revealing long-buried secrets and rewriting the future they all knew. The park, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, seemed surreal to Ryan, Mrs. Grace, Sophie, and Helena, and the contrast between the chaos they had left behind in New York and the tranquility of this moment in the past was disconcerting. "We need to be careful," Mrs. Grace whispered, her eyes never leaving her younger self seated on the bench. "Any interference could change the course of history." Ryan nodded, still holding the now silent painting. "What exactly are we looking for here?" Helena, who had recovered from the initial shock, spoke. "We need to discover the exact moment when everything began. The meeting between Grace and Charles, the deal with Edward Morgan, everything." Sophie, who was attentively observing the young Grace, suddenly tugged on her grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma, look! Someone's coming." They all turned to see a man approaching the young Grace. Even from a distance, Ryan immediately recognized his father's features. "It's him," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "My father." Mrs. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, as if the sight was too painful. "The day we met," she murmured. "The day everything changed." The group watched fascinated as the young Charles Matthews introduced himself to the Grace of the past. Even from a distance, it was possible to see the immediate interest in both their eyes, the spark of a connection that would change their lives forever. "We need to get closer," Helena said. "Maybe we can hear what they're saying." Cautiously, the group moved closer, hiding behind some bushes. Now they could clearly hear the conversation. "Your work is extraordinary, Miss Parker," Charles was saying, admiring Grace's sketch. "I've never seen anything like it." The young Grace smiled, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews." "It's very kind of you." "Please call me Charles," he replied with a charming smile. "Actually, I'd like to make you a proposal. I'm organizing an exhibition in my gallery and would love to include some of your works." The young Grace's eyes widened with surprise and joy. "Really? That would be amazing." As they watched the scene unfold, Ryan couldn't help but notice the expression of pain on Mrs. Grace's face beside him. "Did you know?" he asked softly. "Did you know he was married?" Mrs. Grace shook her head sadly. "Not at that moment. I only found out weeks later when I was already—" Suddenly, Sophie let out a small, muffled cry. "There! The Shadow Man!" They all followed the girl's gaze and saw, partially hidden behind a distant tree, the figure of Edward Morgan. He was observing the interaction between Charles and the young Grace with a cold, calculating interest. "He was already planning," Helena murmured, "from the very beginning." At that moment, something strange began to happen. The scenery around them began to ripple, as if it were melting. The park, Charles, the young Grace, everything began to dissolve. "What's happening?" Ryan asked, alarmed. Mrs. Grace grabbed Sophie's arm. "It's the painting. It's taking us to another moment." In seconds, the park had completely disappeared, and they found themselves in a new scenario, the luxurious office they had seen portrayed in the painting. Charles Matthews was there, a few years older, sitting behind an imposing desk. Before him stood Edward Morgan, a cold smile on his lips. "Think carefully, Charles," Edward was saying, his voice smooth but threatening. "This deal will make us the most powerful men in the country. All we need to do is ignore some insignificant details." Charles seemed hesitant, conflict clear in his eyes. "But the indigenous communities, their lands—" Edward made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Progress always has a price, my friend. Besides, think of your family, your son, the future you can provide for them." Ryan felt his heart tighten upon hearing these words. His father was being manipulated, using him as justification for his questionable actions. Before they could see Charles's response, the scenery began to change again. This time they found themselves in an art studio where the Grace of the past was working furiously on a canvas. With a shock, Ryan recognized the painting. It was the same one he now carried in his arms. "It's here," Mrs. Grace whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "The moment I painted the truth without even knowing it." They watched fascinated as the Grace of the past painted, her eyes half closed as if in a trance. On the canvas, the office scene came to life, each brushstroke revealing more details of the dark deal between Charles and Edward. Suddenly, the studio door violently swung open. Charles Matthews entered, his face a mask of panic upon seeing the painting. "Grace, what have you done?" he asked, his voice trembling. The Grace of the past turned, confusion on her face. "Charles, what's wrong?" "That painting. It can't exist," Charles said, advancing towards the canvas. "You don't understand the danger." At that moment, the scenery began to dissolve again. Ryan, Mrs. Grace, Sophie and Helena found themselves back in the present, in the alley behind the Velasco Gallery. "We're back," Helena said, looking around in amazement. Ryan looked at the painting in his arms, which now seemed normal, without any supernatural glow. "What happened? Why did we come back?" Mrs. Grace took a deep breath, her eyes full of newly acquired understanding. "The painting showed us what we needed to see, the truth behind everything." Sophie, who had remained silent throughout the experience, suddenly pointed to the entrance of the alley. "Look!" Edward Morgan was there, flanked by his men, a triumphant smile on his face. "Well, well," he said, his cold voice cutting through the air. It seems I've finally caught up with you. And I see you've brought exactly what I want." Ryan held the painting more firmly, placing himself protectively in front of Mrs. Grace and Sophie. Helena took a step forward, as if wanting to negotiate. But before anyone could speak, a new voice echoed through the alley. "Not so fast, Edward." Everyone turned to see Anthony Ferreira emerging from the shadows, a glowing object in his hands. "I think it's time we reveal all the secrets, don't you agree?" Anthony said, an enigmatic smile on his face. The air in the alley became charged with tension. Secrets from the past, threats from the present, and uncertainties of the future were converging at this crucial moment. Ryan knew that the next actions would determine not only his fate, but that of everyone around him. The truth was about to come to light, and nothing would be the same again. The alley behind the Velasco Gallery seemed to freeze in time. On one side, Ryan, Mrs. Grace, Sophie, and Helena protecting the painting that carried so many secrets. On the other, Edward Morgan and his men ready to take by force what they believed to be rightfully theirs. And in the middle, like an unexpected wildcard, Anthony Ferreira, holding a mysterious and glowing object. "Enough games, Anthony," Edward growled, his patience clearly running out. "What do you think you're doing?" Anthony smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Doing justice, Edward. Something that should have been done a long time ago." With a fluid movement, Anthony revealed the object in his hands. It was a small canvas, no larger than a book, but it glowed with a supernatural light, similar to what they had seen in the larger painting. Mrs. Grace gasped, recognition in her eyes. "The preliminary study," she whispered. "I thought it had been destroyed." Ryan looked at her, confused. "Preliminary study?" "Before painting the main picture," Mrs. Grace explained, her voice trembling. "I made a small study. It captured the essence of the moment, but in a more raw form, more truthful." Edward took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the small canvas. "Hand over the paintings, now, or the consequences will be severe." But before anyone could react, Sophie stepped forward, her eyes shining with wisdom beyond her years. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "It's time for the truth to come to light." As if responding to the girl's words, both paintings, the large one in Ryan's arms and the small one in Anthony's hands, began to glow intensely. A blinding light enveloped everyone in the alley, and when it dimmed, they found themselves in an ethereal space, as if they were inside the paintings themselves. Images began to form around them, scenes from the past unfolding like a movie. They saw Charles Matthews, young and ambitious, being manipulated by Edward to make the deal that would displace indigenous communities. They witnessed the budding love between Charles and Grace, and the heartbreaking moment when she discovered he was married. They observed Edward threatening Grace, demanding that she hand over the painting that revealed the truth about the corrupt deal. And finally they saw Anthony, not as the villain they thought he was, but as someone who had dedicated his life to exposing the truth, even if his methods were questionable. When the images dissipated, everyone was back in the alley. But something had changed. The air seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Edward Morgan was on his knees, the weight of his crimes finally crushing his arrogance. "It's over," he murmured, defeated. Ryan turned to Anthony, understanding dawning in his eyes. You were trying to protect the truth all along?" Anthony nodded slowly. "I loved Grace," he admitted, "but more than that, I loved the truth she captured in her art. I spent decades trying to expose the lies and corruption that this painting revealed." Mrs. Grace stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Anthony, I'm sorry for not trusting you." At that moment, sirens began to sound in the distance. Helena, who had silently made a call during the chaos, announced, "The police are on their way. With all the evidence we have now, Edward and his accomplices will finally face justice." As the authorities arrived and Edward was taken away, Ryan found himself reflecting on everything he had learned. About his father, who despite his mistakes, had tried to protect his family. About Mrs. Grace, whose art had the power to reveal hidden truths. And about Sophie, his newly discovered sister, whose gift promises a future where the truth will always find a way to come to light. Weeks passed. The Matthews mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and secrets, now pulsed with new life. Ryan had officially recognized Sophie as his sister, and Mrs. Grace moved permanently to the property. On a sunny afternoon, Ryan found Mrs. Grace and Sophie in the garden. The elderly woman was teaching her granddaughter the secrets of her art, while Sophie painted with a passion and talent that reminded Ryan of his own mother. "You know," Mrs. Grace said, looking at Ryan with a soft smile, "there's beauty even in the most painful stories. It's like a painting. Sometimes we need to take a step back to see the complete picture." Ryan nodded, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. "And now? What do we do with the paintings?" Mrs. Grace looked at Sophie, who was absorbed in her painting. "I think it's time to share the truth with the world. Not to punish or shame, but to heal and learn." "An exhibition," Ryan suggested, the idea taking shape in his mind. "We can tell the whole story, from the beginning until now." Sophie looked up, her eyes shining. "And I can help. I can paint the future, a better future for all of us." Ryan and Mrs. Grace laughed, embracing the girl. The future indeed seemed bright. Months later, the Velasco Gallery was packed. The Canvases of Truth exhibition attracted critics, art lovers, and even political figures. Mrs. Grace's paintings, including the famous portrait of Charles Matthews, were displayed side by side with Sophie's new works, creating a powerful narrative of past, present, and future. In a quiet corner of the gallery, Ryan found Anthony Ferreira observing one of Sophie's paintings. It was a portrait of a thriving community where people from different backgrounds lived in harmony. "She has an extraordinary gift," Anthony commented. Ryan nodded. "Just like her grandmother." The two men stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "You know," Anthony finally said, "I spent so much time focused on the past, trying to correct old mistakes, that I almost lost sight of the future. But looking at these paintings, maybe there's hope after all." Ryan smiled, placing a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "There's always hope. That's what I learned from all this. The past shapes us, but it doesn't define us. It's what we do from now on that really matters." As the night progressed and the exhibition came to an end, Ryan gathered his new family, Mrs. Grace, Sophie, and even Helena, who had become a close friend. Together, they watched the visitors leaving, many with tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces, touched by the story they had witnessed through art. "And now?" Sophie asked, looking at Ryan with eyes full of expectation. Ryan smiled, hugging his younger sister. "Now, my dear, we paint our own future, together." And so, under the starry sky of New York, a family once divided by secrets and lies found itself united by the power of truth and love. The canvases of the past had been revealed, but it was the blank canvases of the future that now called to them, ready to be filled with colors of hope, redemption, and new possibilities.